They set me up on a blind date with an overweight woman. But one thing I said left the entire table silent. The night Ryan set me up at that dinner with Sophie Carter, I learned an ugly truth about the people around me. Some people don't need love. They just need an audience. My name is Nathan Cole, 34 years old. And at that point, I'd been single long enough that everyone around me had started treating it like a community problem that needed solving. My sister sent me women's profiles. My coworkers pulled pranks. My friends gave speeches about getting back out there, as if dating were some civic duty I was refusing to perform. I wasn't bitter, just tired. The year before, I'd gone through a quiet breakup with a woman who loved the idea of a stable man right up until that stability started looking too much like an ordinary life. No scandal, no cheating, just two people slowly admitting they wanted different futures and convincing themselves that made it hurt less. After that, I stepped away from dating for a while, not because I was broken, but because, for the first time in years, I felt peaceful. Then Ryan called me. Small group, he said. Nothing weird. I should have hung up right then. The restaurant was the kind of place where the lighting was dim enough to hide regrets and the menu used far too many adjectives to describe potatoes. When I walked in, Ryan was already seated at a long table with his wife, two other couples, and an empty chair beside a woman I'd never met before. She looked up when I arrived, and before anyone said a word, I saw everything. Not because she did anything wrong, because the room did. That tiny shift people make when they think they're about to watch something entertaining. The quick glances, the restrained smiles. Ryan's wife suddenly becoming very interested in her wine glass. A guy at the far end leaning back as if he'd bought a ticket to a show. The woman sitting beside that empty chair noticed it too. I could tell. Her name was Sophie, around my age, maybe early 30s. Warm brown eyes, shoulder-length dark hair, a navy blue dress that was simple in the best possible way. She was plus-sized, yes, but that wasn't the first thing I noticed. The first thing I noticed was her stillness. Not shyness, stillness. Like someone who had walked into the room, immediately taken its measure, and decided not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Ryan stood up too quickly. Nathan, there he is. I gave him a look he understood perfectly. This is Sophie, he said, gesturing with the enthusiasm of a game show host carrying a guilty conscience. Sophie, this is Nathan. Sophie offered a polite smile. Hi. Hi. Then Ryan added, we thought you two might, hit it off. The entire table went silent. There it was. Not a date. A test. Maybe even a joke. I didn't know what reaction they were expecting from me. Awkwardness, maybe. An uncomfortable laugh. A gentle excuse to escape. Perhaps they thought I'd be shallow enough to make them feel superior for noticing it. Instead, I pulled out the chair and sat down beside Sophie. Good, I said, because I was hoping there'd be at least one person here whose 3 favorite stories I haven't already heard 100 times. Sophie looked at me, really looked at me. One corner of her mouth twitched as if she were fighting not to laugh. Ryan blinked. Wow. Starting aggressive, huh? You invited me to a surprise dinner with witnesses, I said. Aggressive feels appropriate. A few people laughed, but it was the nervous kind. Good. Sophie lifted her water glass. For the record, she said, I was also told this was a normal dinner. I turned toward her. So we were both tricked. Looks that way. Solid foundation. This time her smile appeared fully. Small, sharp, beautiful. That was when I knew the evening might not go the way the room had expected. For the first 20 minutes, everyone tried and failed to act normal. Conversations kept drifting toward us and then away again, like people checking whether a chemistry experiment had exploded yet. Sophie handled it with more grace than any of them deserved. She taught high school art. Once accidentally ordered 70 pounds of clay instead of 7 because, according to her, the supplier's website looked like it had been designed by a raccoon with Wi-Fi. She loved used bookstores, hated cilantro, and had a very specific theory that every terrible date could be identified within the first 10 minutes based on how the man treated the waitstaff. That sounds harsh, I said. That's the generous version, she replied. It used to be 20 minutes. I laughed. A real laugh, not the polite kind. The kind that made Ryan glance over with an expression I couldn't quite read. Maybe confusion, maybe disappointment, maybe the uncomfortable realization that the person he'd assumed would be the punchline was becoming the most interesting person at the table. Then one of the husbands, Craig, opened his mouth and confirmed my lowest expectations. He leaned back in his chair, grinning. "Be honest, Nathan," he said. "Is Sophie your type?" The table froze. Sophie's face barely changed. But I saw her hand tighten around her fork. That was the moment. The moment the entire evening had been building toward, the moment everyone would find out what kind of man I was willing to be when a woman's dignity was placed on the table and people waited for me to laugh along with them. I set my glass down slowly. Then I looked at Craig and said, "No." The room went silent. Sophie lowered her eyes. And before that silence had a chance to turn cruel, I continued. "She's smarter, warmer, and more interesting than most women I've been lucky enough to sit beside." I turned slightly toward Sophie, not for show, but to make sure she heard me clearly. "So, if you're asking whether I usually get set up with someone this interesting, then no, I don't." Nobody moved. Craig's grin disappeared first. Ryan's wife stared into her wine glass. Sophie looked up at me, and for a second, all the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. Then I looked back at Craig. "And if you were about to ask something else," I said calmly. "Don't." That left the entire table speechless, exactly like the title promised. Sophie looked at me. Not the polite smile she'd worn earlier, a real one. Then she said with perfect composure, "Well, that was unexpected." I picked up the menu. Unexpected in a good way, or unexpected in a I should escape through the kitchen kind of way. She leaned slightly closer, just a little. "Ask me again after dessert." And for the first time all evening, I forgot the room was watching us. Dessert became the safest deadline anyone had ever given me. Not because the room got any more pleasant, because Sophie did. After Craig's comment had been shut down, the table seemed to lose its appetite for cruelty and spent the rest of the evening pretending it had never happened. That was always the pattern with people like that. They enjoy the dramatic moment right up until it requires accountability. Sophie didn't make it easy for them. She didn't leave. She didn't shrink into herself. She didn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her visibly hurt. Instead, she simply turned back toward me and resumed our conversation as if the rest of the table had become background music. We talked about books, students, the suspicious Wi-Fi raccoon. When the server came by, she ordered chocolate cake and 2 forks without asking me. I looked at her. "Bold assumption. You defended my honor," she said. "You've earned half the cake. Is that a rule?" "It is now." By the end of dinner, people started gathering coats and checking phones. Sophie slipped her purse over her shoulder. "I'm going outside for a little air." I followed about 2 minutes later. She was standing beneath the restaurant awning, her arms loosely folded, city lights caught in her dark hair. She looked calm, almost too calm. I stepped beside her. "You okay?" She smiled without looking at me. "That question's been asked a lot tonight." "That's not an answer." "No." She glanced down at the sidewalk. "I'm okay. I'm just tired of having to be okay in rooms where people are waiting for me not to be." There was an entire history behind that sentence. I didn't rush it. She glanced over. "You handled Craig well. He made it easy." "No." Her voice softened. "He made it familiar." That hurt more than I expected. Sophie took a slow breath. I knew what tonight was about 5 minutes after I sat down. Ryan's wife kept smiling too hard. Craig looked like he was waiting for a reaction. I almost left. "Why didn't you?" This time she looked directly at me. "Because you walked in." Something tightened in my chest. Not because it was romantic. Because it was trust given before I'd done anything to deserve it. The restaurant door opened behind us. Ryan stepped outside, hands shoved into his coat pockets, wearing the uncomfortable expression of a man who knew he owed an apology but hoped the sidewalk might deliver it for him. "Nathan," he said, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Sophie glanced between us. "I can give you some space." "No," I said. "You can stay." Ryan's expression immediately worsened. "Good." He deserved a witness, too. He scratched the back of his neck. "Look, I didn't mean to make things weird." Sophie let out a small laugh. "That's an incredible sentence." Ryan glanced at her before turning back to me. "I just thought you two might actually get along." "That part might be true," I said. "The problem is that you invited us as people and watched us like entertainment." That hit exactly where it needed to. Ryan looked down. Sophie stepped forward slightly. "I don't need anyone punished," she said quietly. "I just need fewer people confusing cruelty with honesty." For the first time all night, Ryan looked genuinely ashamed. Finally, "I'm sorry," he said. Sophie nodded once. "Accepted, not erased." That made me look at her again. Because that's the kind of strength people often miss when they're too busy judging what's easy to see. Ryan went back inside after that, leaving the two of us alone beneath the awning. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Sophie looked at me and said, "You know, I had an entire speech prepared. For him? For the whole table. All of them. It was good too. Sharp. Brutal. Maybe a little too long. What happened to it?" She smiled. "You ruined it." "I'm sorry." "No, you're not." "No," I admitted. "Not really." A light rain began to fall, gentle enough that neither of us bothered moving. Sophie glanced up at the sky and then back at me. "So," she said, "you asked first? Unexpected in a good way or a kitchen exit kind of way?" I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and looked at her properly. "The good way." Her smile spread slowly. Warmer this time. "Good," she said, "because I was hoping you'd ask me out without an audience." And just like that, the evening stopped belonging to the people who had arranged it. Saturday arrived slower than I expected. I spent Friday answering 3 text messages from Ryan. The last one read, "You're still mad at me, aren't you?" I replied, "You disappointed me." "That's worse." He never answered. Good. Sophie met me at the downtown bookstore at 11 in the morning, wearing jeans, a rust-colored sweater, and a denim jacket with paint stains on one sleeve. No performance. No effort to impress. Just her. "Before we begin," she said, "I judge people based on which section they walk toward first. High stakes. Extremely." We spent 2 hours in that store. She pulled books off shelves and explained which covers were lying to readers. I showed her the employee recommendation wall. She made me choose a poetry collection. I made her choose a cookbook. Neither of us bought what we originally intended to buy. That felt like some kind of sign. Afterward, we went to a small corner cafe, the kind with mismatched chairs and window seats that somehow encouraged honesty. Halfway through our coffee, Sophie stirred her drink and asked, "Can I ask something awkward? Considering how we met, I think we left normal behind a while ago." She smiled, then grew serious. "Did you feel like you had to protect me?" I could have answered immediately. "I didn't." "No," I said. "I felt like Craig was trying to turn you into the punchline of a joke I refused to laugh at." Her eyes held mine. "What if I could have handled it myself? Then I would have enjoyed watching him suffer." She laughed, a bright, genuine laugh that drew a glance from the table behind us. Then she looked down at her cup. "I'm used to people making decisions about me before I even speak," she said quietly. "Men, especially." She looked back up. "So when you looked at me like I was simply the person sitting next to you, it mattered." Something tightened in my chest. "You were," I said. "That's all." The date didn't end after coffee. It turned into a walk through an art supply store where she bought paintbrushes and forced me to guess what each one was used for. I was confidently wrong almost every time. She respected the confidence more than the accuracy. By late afternoon, we were standing outside her apartment building. Neither of us had a good reason to extend the date, except for the obvious one. Then her phone buzzed. She checked the screen and her expression changed. Not fear. Exhaustion. A text from Ryan's wife. "I heard you and Nathan are actually dating." Cute. Looks like the setup worked after all. Sophie stared at it for a second. Then she looked at me. "I really don't want them thinking they deserve credit for this." I glanced at the message and then back at her. "They don't." She searched my face. "No? No." I stepped a little closer. "They created a bad room." My eyes stayed on hers. "You created everything worth staying for." The expression that crossed her face then was softer than anything I'd seen from her before. Before either of us could say anything else, she slipped her phone into her pocket and said quietly, "Then come upstairs for tea, Nathan. I'm not ready for this date to end." Sophie's apartment was warm, bright, and full of things that made immediate sense once you knew her. Framed student artwork covered one wall. Stacks of sketchbooks sat on the coffee table. Plants occupied every windowsill, some thriving beautifully, others surviving almost entirely on optimism. She made tea and brought 2 mugs over to the couch. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. Apartment plumbing that never worked properly. The smell of a really good bookstore. Whether adults should be allowed to own more than one decorative blanket. Then she fell quiet. Sophie looked down at her mug and said, "The thing about being turned into a joke is that people always expect you to be grateful when someone else stops the joke." I understood immediately. You don't want to be thanked for basic decency. Her eyes lifted to mine. "Exactly. You don't have to be." Something about that seemed to reach her more deeply than any compliment could have. She leaned back against the couch. I liked what you did. I really did. But I liked even more that afterward you didn't treat me like I was fragile. A small smile touched my face. You threatened to judge my bookstore performance. You needed the pressure. I did well. You did. The silence that followed was softer. Not empty. Full. Sophie set her mug down. Nathan. Yeah. I don't need a speech. I don't need reassurance. Just the truth. She looked directly at me. Did tonight change the way you see me? Yes, I said. Something flickered across her expression. So I continued before fear could fill the silence with the wrong answer. It made me see you more clearly. I held her gaze. I already thought you were beautiful. But tonight I saw the way you held your ground. The way you refused to become bitter even when people handed you every reason to be. The way you can accept an apology without pretending the wound never happened. I leaned a little closer. That changed the way I see you. It made me want to know who you really are. Sophie's eyes brightened, but she smiled through it. That, she whispered, is dangerously accurate. I've been told accuracy matters. It does. Then she kissed me. Not because I had rescued her. Not because the evening had hurt her and I happened to be convenient comfort. It was a choice. Clear. Warm. Entirely her own. Ryan gave a real apology a week later. Not through text. In person. He came to my office looking uncomfortable and said, I thought I was being funny. I wasn't. I'm sorry. I told him, tell her that. And he did. Sophie accepted it the same way she had outside that restaurant. Accepted. Not erased. That became one of the first things I loved about her. She never pretended pain was smaller than it was just to make other people comfortable. But she never allowed it to become the whole room, either. 3 months later, she invited me to her school's spring art exhibition. I watched her move through the gymnasium while students pulled her from one display to the next, each one desperate for her to see what they had created. She glowed there, not because of what she was wearing, because she was exactly where she belonged. A year later, we moved in together. Not because of anything dramatic, because Sunday mornings had started feeling strange when we woke up in different places. She brought too many blankets. I brought too many books. We compromised by buying more shelves and pretending that solved anything. 2 years later, I proposed in a bookstore. Not in front of a crowd, no microphone, no grand speech. Just Sophie standing in the art section, holding a book she had absolutely no intention of buying. She turned around and found me with a ring and the most honest sentence I had. I don't want to be the man who protected you for one night, I told her. I want to be the man who chooses you every ordinary day after that. She cried, then laughed. Then said yes before accusing me of using the location to manipulate her emotions. She was right. I absolutely was. And years later, when people ask how we met, Sophie always smiles and says, a group of people arranged it very badly. And I always add, fortunately, they underestimated both of us. So what would you do if your friends set you up on a blind date as a joke and the person sitting beside you turned out to be the most interesting person in the room? And has anyone ever underestimated you before they had the chance to learn who you really were? Share your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.